Okay, water quality in the mineralization tank. Well, what is mineralization, okay? It's a fancy word. Don't get intimidated. So many people over the last few years, when mineralization has become a hot topic, have thought about this as the gold standard and the the giant box with a question mark on it, that it's this fascinating thing and we need to know how this works and it's the key to everything. It's not the key to everything, guys, okay? I grew for 7 years without mineralization and I killed it, okay? Crops and crops galore. They looked great. Mineralization just allows us to extend those resources a little more. We get a little bit more out of the fish feed. So think of this as aqueous composting. That's an easier way of thinking of it. Who hasn't had a compost pile, right? Any dirt gardener, any farmer, you throw your stuff in the compost pile, it breaks down. After it stabilizes it, you use it on the crop. That's what we're doing. We're just doing it in an aqueous solution. And instead of breaking it down into a solid matter, we're breaking it down into a dissolved nutrient form, okay? Dissolving it in that water. It's that easy. It's aquatic composting. We're just composting in a big water tank. Just like in terrestrial compost bin, waste is broken down by a variety of microorganisms and nutrients are converted into more usable forms that are readily available for plants to absorb. So from my findings, looking under a microscope, more than 90% of the microfauna in that mineralization tank are the same microfauna that I find in a terrestrial compost bin. And this is keeping this at 100% saturated with oxygen. So what does that mean? That means we're seeing the same thing. These are two beasts in different forms that are doing the same thing. And the same functions are happening because we have that air source. Because, when we have a lower air volume and we get passive denitrification happening, we're getting the same thing happening in the lower grades of the soil that have less oxygen trapped in there and that are getting our denitrification happening, okay? There are so many similarities here, but we just have to see them for what they are. It's not this mystical mineralization machine. We're just composting some extra nutrients, getting our beneficials to release them, to chelate them into usable forms for the plants. And then we're putting them back in the system and letting the plants utilize that and benefit from the process at hand. It's just separated. In the soil, this is happening in around the roots. Where we're doing this is isolated and engineered so that we can control what's happening. There's a big nasty picture of a mineralization tank. So here's a picture of a mineralization tank, just showing you again, it might look like a lot of brown sludge water, but there's some magic going on in there, and we're really just composting. If you picture this as a big lumped over mass of compost material, same thing, same spot. That's what we're doing. So the following table is going to represent the nutrient composition of water while running the stage 1 mineralization tank using 2 CFM of air. DO in vessel is maintained at saturation, so the dissolved oxygen is still maintained at average 8 parts per million, but that depends on the time of the year and the temperature. But this allows settling and denitrification to occur within the settled mass while off-gassing any hydrogen sulfide or methane created. So this isn't just an anaerobic filter. This is an aerobic mineralization tank that allows for some anaerobic mineralization to occur within it. So we're just not keeping every single thing within suspension. We're allowing some of it to settle out and create those anaerobic zones that are actually going to do a little bit different processes than what we've got going on in the aerobic zones. Several variables are in play with these numbers, but there's some relevant conclusions that can be drawn, okay? So things to think about. Well, I've got a bunch of different crops growing at the same time in my greenhouse while this was taken, all right? The feed rate was constant, but the crops growing were not constant, and we had different life stages happening. So I tried while maintaining my operation and my livelihood, I tried to gather as much relevant data as possible from this, but this was not a static situation tested in triplicate with only adding fish food and only testing end results out of the end of the filter. So there's definitely more research to be done here, but unfortunately there's only so much time in the day, and this is where I'm at right now. I've got some further numbers that we've got on an isolated mineralization tank that I'm doing tests on, but it's not ready to be released yet. But stay in contact with me, and when it is, you will get that information as well. In this table, we're going to take a look at our macro-micronutrients within the system, the recirculating aquaponics system water, within stage 1 of the mineralization tank, and then within stage 2 of the mineralization tank, okay? And this will kind of let us see what's happening in each stage of mineralization, what nutrients are being processed, converted, and then sometimes actually consumed. And again, it gives us reference points for what we're actually getting out of a mineralization tank that we would be losing if we were just discarding this waste, using it for agricultural uses or selling it for a soil amendment. So down this first vertical column, as you can see, we've got pH, we've got our nitrogen is nitrate, we've got phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, sodium, calcium, zinc, iron, manganese, boron, sulfur, copper, and molybdenum. So we've got all of our micros and macros here, and then we've got pH as well. Our next column gives us recirculating level in aquaponic water. So that's taken directly out of my sump and run through a colorimeter and also sent out for a spectrophotometer test from an outside lab so that we could confirm and make sure there was no error in the testing that I did here on premises. Figured if I'm going to do this for data, I wanted to confirm this through multiple places, okay? And one, it also told me my colorimeter was giving me good readings. So we're looking at recirculating level in aquaponic water. We can see have a 6.2 pH. Nitrogen is 25 parts per million. We've got 42 phosphorus, 82 on potassium, magnesium, sodium. We've got all of our levels here in the recirculating system. And then we look over into the stage 1 mineralization tank, and we can see this first, again, table is with the lower aeration. Lower aeration, we have a fairly significant jump in pH from our recirculating water to the stage 1. What does that tell us? Through everything we've learned, it tells us there's denitrification happening, and that's why the pH is slowly and slightly raising. So we've got a pH of 6.7 in this stage 1 mineralization tank. Nitrogen goes from 25 to 48. And remember, this is a concentrated small area, so this will actually dilute down once we dose it into that large volume of water. But we do see that spike up, meaning we're getting further release of ammonia and thus nitrate nitrogen in this mineralization tank. We see phosphorus goes from 42 to 76. We got a major release of phosphorus in this first stage of mineralization tank. Okay, and we can go back down the entire level of nutrients here. I could read them off to you, but you can see we gain in most nutrients here. There's only a few areas where we don't see a little more release, like molybdenum and copper down here. We don't see much more release through the mineralization process, but through the rest of these, we can see significant amounts further released because we're removing or that concentrated waste, and we're allowing those nutrients to be broken down out of that concentrated waste. So in the stage 2 mineralization tank, you can see where our pH has dropped again to 6.5. That means we have nitrification happening there, and we don't have denitrification happening. So we get a drop from 6.7 to 6.5 while it's processing whatever ammonia is left in that water column. Okay, our nitrogen is nitrate. Okay, we go from 25 to 48, then to 67 in that tank. So it shows you, again, we're still processing ammonia into nitrate nitrogen, and this is more of a stabilized number. That's going to be holding in there after our ammonia has been processed to 0. We can see phosphorus goes from 76 to 80, so we don't have much more release Going into stage 2, there's a little bit of release, and that could be from cell die-off that gets moved into there. Could be from several other factors. But the point is, there's a little bit more released moving into that stage. We go potassium here, 98 stays at 98. It's not much of a difference. A lot of these don't make much of a difference moving from stage 1 to stage 2 because stage 2 is really a stabilizing unit. This is to off-gas anything that's created during that denitrification process and to further process any ammonia or any of those byproducts through nitrification. Okay, so we could follow back down this entire list, but the main thing is, look, we can look across the board and see what's actually happening and whether it's worth it. In a really large scale operation, it might be easier to just truck all this stuff off to a field and spread it and lay it down and add in the little bits of nutrients, again, that we're claiming out of this, and just add those in like any hydroponic grower would add them. Is that the perfect way? No, but that is another way, and that might be the right way for the operation that you're planning. So just go ahead and throw that out there. Water quality in the mineralization tank. Well, the following table that we're coming up to now is going to represent the nutrient composition of water running the stage 1 mineralization tank using 8 CFM of air. Okay, so our totally aerobic mineralization tank. The dissolved oxygen in this vessel is maintained at saturation, but does not allow settling and denitrification to occur within the vessel due to the heavy agitation, which we've talked about before. This is a quicker process. The denitrification takes longer for those nutrients to break down. This is actually a bit of a quicker process than that main 40 days, so it will happen quicker. And in this table, we can see, again, we have the same columns. We have the macro and micronutrients here. We have recirculating level in the aquaponic water, stage 1 mineralization tank, and stage 2 mineralization tank. And if we look at the pH here, we can see it's 6.2 starting off, and then in stage 1 mineralization tank, we still get a slight pH raise. Because of so much waste, there's actually still minor denitrification happening in that vessel. Even though it's highly aerated, nothing's settling, there's still going to be a small amount happening within even the fecal casing on, say, a tilapia feces, okay? While that thing comes out, before it's actually broken down on the interior of that, you start to get a little bit of denitrification happening. So, an anaerobic activity. So we can see it does still slightly go up, but after stage 2, it comes back down to 6.3. So we really don't have a significant jump in the pH there between our recirculating water and coming out of the second stage of the mineralization tank. Because, again, we're going to have small amounts of water coming out of this mineralization tank back into the main system, which is a very large volume of water in comparison. So we see nitrogen as nitrate. We've got 25 in the recirculating level in the system. Stage 1 mineralization tank, we're at 60. Stage 2, we're at 78. So we can really see the aerobic process there. And we got our major breakdown aerobically here in stage 1, but then we still have some residual ammonia left in the water that's broken down further in stage 2 and jumps that level of nitrate nitrogen up. Now, if we look at this, 78 coming out of stage 2 for our nitrogen, and then we look back 2 slides to the lower dissolved oxygen level system for mineralization, we can see we're at 67. So from 78 to 67, we can see what was actually lost due to denitrification. That difference of nitrogen was what was off-gassed through that anaerobic process. Okay, in some operations, you may look at that and say, I don't want to lose that nitrogen. That's worth it to me. I don't want to have to add that back in, and I don't need all of the, say, fruiting type nutrients to be boosted in relation to nitrogen. Say if you're just growing leafy greens, something like that. Well, that tells you right there, this probably isn't the type of mineralization tank that you want to run. But if you're growing fruiting vegetables, this might be more attractive to you. Okay, so there's not a huge amount of off-gassing. We're not off-gassing nitrogen to 0 from 78 to 67, so it's not a huge amount. We see phosphorus from 42 to 51 to 49, so nowhere near as much of a phosphorus release there. I believe a lot more of that phosphorus is going to be maybe bound in cell mass. That's a guess, due to the heavy nitrification, the heavy flocks that are formed. And then we can look down the rest of the list here, our potassium, magnesium, sodium, and you can see, again, there's not a huge difference between stage 1 and stage 2 in most of these, but the main difference is going to be between our recirculating level and that stage 1 where the main breakdown action happens. So what is the mineralization tank and its microbiota producing or releasing to alter our nutrient profile? Well, I think we just got a pretty good idea of that, right? Looking at those tables, we can see what they're producing and what's altered in our water chemistry by running through those filter tanks. With lower volumes of air delivered to stage 1 mineralization tank, we will still see release of nitrogen, but it is apparent there's a small amount of off-gassing that happens due to denitrification. We see a greater release of phosphorus, magnesium, potassium, and a few other of the micronutrients. We change the nitrogen to phosphorus ratio by releasing nitrogen into the environment and releasing phosphorus into the water. Okay, that's what we're doing with the lower volume of air mineralization setup. That's really how you're changing the NPK ratio. Off-gassing nitrogen, releasing more phosphorus. And together, that does a significant change to the nutrient balance in your system. Using high volumes of air, the most significant addition is that it releases more nitrogen into the system, along with smaller amounts of potassium, magnesium, phosphorus, and other micronutrients that you can find in those tables. Multiple species of beneficial fungi, beneficial bacteria, and other symbiotes inhabit the mineralization tank and are transferred into the hydroponic component. Okay, that is very important. So just like a compost brewing machine or compost brewing tank, we're not only releasing those nutrients, but we're breeding beneficial microorganisms that are going to work as symbionts with our plant's root system. That's the difference between aquaponics and hydroponics. Okay, it's not a sterile system where we want to eliminate anything in that water column and you know, do everything we can to make sure it stays sterile. We want to count on our population of beneficial organisms to take care of any unintended, unwanted pathogens or organisms. So instead of fighting them with sterility, we're fighting them with beneficial beneficial organisms. Just like going pesticide free in a greenhouse for produce production. We can either spray pesticides and kill everything and keep an extremely dead and sterile environment, or we can incorporate integrated pest management practices, incorporate beneficial bugs that will kill the bad bugs, and you're going to recreate a more natural environment, mimicking nature when you go about it that route. Okay, so hopefully that explains it a little easier. How does this affect our plant growth and nutrient availability? Well, by breaking down the solid waste to further release nutrients for the hydroponic component, we lower the volume of feed needed per given area of plant. Okay, so that's the big takeaway. Why would anybody go through all this nonsense to break down the waste further when we could just open the valves and be done with it, like aquaculture does in most cases? Well, same feed volume, more plants. It's that simple. If we're making the majority of your money, or my money, whoever's doing it, if you're making the majority of your money on plants and the fish are a very small portion of your revenue stream, then it would make sense to minimize the fish portion, minimize the cost of the equipment to build the fish portion to start off, and maximize the plant portion if that's where you're really going to be making your money. And again, you look back at your business plan to tell you that. Now, let's say you're going to get a great amount of money for the fish that you're raising, and in your business plan, it seems like a better option to grow more fish in comparison to the plant volume. Well, that's real easy. You can knock out the mineralization aspect of this, and that will lower the amount of plants that you can grow compared to the fish volume. That way you're growing more fish compared to the plants in retrospect to everything else we've talked about. All right, so there's ways to alter this, but the way I think about it is it has to make sense on the money side of things, or the production. If you're growing fish to feed people, you know, whatever your reason for doing this may be, it has to make sense, because just because you want to grow more fish, don't grow more fish because you like fish. Do it because you're going to make more money on them, or don't do it. You know, focus your energy and your efforts where the money's at. When is a mineralization tank appropriate? Well, when trying to grow as many plants as possible and as few fish as possible in relation, okay? Doesn't mean we have to grow a tiny amount of fish. We could still grow 100,000 pounds of fish a year. But if we want to get the most plants out of that, like I've mentioned over and over, we mineralize the waste. When trying to naturally alter the nitrogen to phosphorus ratio in the hydroponic portion of the system, okay? That's a reason to use mineralization, because you're not going to be able to alter that without adding another outside additive into the system unless you're using biological means to alter it. When trying to bring your waste discharge to zero, so if you're, say, an existing aquaculture facility or even in the plantings and you're going to have waste discharge. Well, if you don't have anybody to sell it to or any crops to spread it on, that's going to cost you money to process and to get rid of. Whether it's through public sewage, whether it's through building a constructed wetland, it's going to cost you money to get rid of that waste. Okay, so in that situation, mineralizing waste makes a lot of money, a lot of sense, because you eliminate the cost to have to get rid of that through other avenues. And when trying to conserve as much water as possible. So when we discharge waste, a heavy amount of that waste, unless we de-water it through, say, a belt screen filter, something like that, to get a really solid waste, and we put all the water back in the system, we actually discharge a good amount of water per day. Again, with a rotating drum filter, about 10% of the system volume of water per day. So you can imagine, let's say we have 4 2,500 gallon tanks, so 10,000 gallons. Well, every single day we're discharging 1,000 gallons of water out of that system. Every 10 days we're discharging 100% of the water, okay, by volume. And every, I think it's 16 days, if you look at the reduction, every 16 days we're throwing out every bit of the nutrients that we've got into the water by dilution, okay? So we're adding more nutrients in, but it tells you how wasteful a drum filter or something like that can be if we don't save the water from it and concentrate the wastes and either use those or break them down and use them within the hydroponic portion. So when is a mineralization tank not appropriate? Well, if you want to grow more fish in relation to plants, don't mineralize the waste and sell off the waste or use it elsewhere. And that's exactly what University of Virgin Islands did. There's nothing wrong with that. You are still much more conservative and resource efficient than a standalone recirculating aquaculture farm, because you're removing a good amount of the waste product, just not all of it. On a large scale, it may or may not be worth the cost and footprint to your facility. We've talked about that, okay? The cost of the equipment to do this, the manpower to do this, and to interact with it, make sure that you're getting the nutrients you want out of it, alter and add any nutrients you need to later to get the right formulation, for a specific crop, something like that. Again, it can add complexity to the design. So that might not be worth the time and effort, because the price of raw nutrients like minerals to add in to adjust the mineral content of a hydroponic solution is really not that much. They're not that much money. So if it's part of your SOP that you're not going to add anything that you don't have to, well, then you're going to mineralize. But if that's not part of it, that's not part of what your customer's buying into, it might be easier just to buy the raw chemicals, add them in at the needed amounts. And It may be easier to perform monthly water tests and dose the missing nutrients to the desired levels. Well, that's what I just mentioned, okay? And that's how we would figure out what we need to add in is we send off the water. We get a water test back. It tells us the nutrient levels, and then we just add in the appropriate amount of the nutrients that are lacking in that system water. It's actually really simple. Okay, so identifying and treating nutrient deficiencies. Well, steps to treatment, number one step is you've got to identify the problem. A lot of things look very similar when you're looking at diseases, nutrient deficiencies, just bad plant stock, etc. A lot of this stuff looks really similar. So then your number one friend is the internet. It really is. There's a ton of images out there that show specific deficiencies for specific plants. Okay, so I would search for similar pictures on the internet in nutrient deficiency book or by talking to other farmers. And there's some nice nutrient deficiency books out there. If anybody wants a link to it, by all means, email me that in your question and answer session and I'll hunt it down. They're a little expensive, but now they've got some books out in color that help to better identify nutrient deficiencies. One of your easiest identification methods, though, is going to be to talk to other farmers. Talk to other people that are running systems similar to yours, and they're probably going to run into similar issues that you run into. So try to bank on their experience and talk to people and get their opinion, and it might help you and save you a lot of legwork on hunting down what the remedy may be. I would start personally, a lot of years of experience, okay? Start by looking at iron, followed by potassium, and then calcium. Those are in 98% of the cases that I deal with, the three nutrients that people have in either wrong concentrations or they have that are lacking in their system. So check these three out first. Don't start through looking at boron deficiencies or manganese. That's just going to confuse you because, again, a lot of this stuff looks similar. Start at these big three. If it's not one of those, you can broaden your search. I would next broaden to magnesium, and then from there, we do not see a lot of shortages in the other nutrients. You may get a little slower growth, a little shortage in phosphorus, some of these other ones, but we're not going to really see a drastic difference in that plant. You're just not going to quite get the production if you're meeting those maximum levels, okay? So if you're just eyeballing this, you're not getting water tests, and you're trying to figure out what's going on, that is exactly how I would start out. And again, 98% of the cases, you're going to be able to figure out with one of these three. Identify the fix. So whether it's an addition of iron, calcium, or potassium, a foliar spray of maybe another type of micronutrient, or an addition of acid because your pH is high and causing nutrients to stay locked up and unavailable to the plants. Okay? We want to identify that fix. pH, we looked at the pH and the pH scale earlier on in this lesson. That's another huge deal. A lot of times people that aren't measuring pH or aren't familiar with the system and aren't able to estimate what's going to happen with that pH. Well, if your pH gets really high, all of a sudden you're going to lock out iron, you're going to lock out slightly potassium, some of these other things, and it will show that you're very nutrient deficient even though you may have the correct level of nutrients in the system. Okay, so pH is right up there with iron, calcium, and potassium. pH is number one, so put it ahead of all of those. But it's not really a nutrient that we're measuring, okay? It's the acidity. Last but not least, but most important here, okay? Make note of the problem, treatment, and outcome for future treatments. So write down your plant species, how mature it is, what size it is, how old it is. Write down the weather, the temperature, what time of year it is, the date. Write down the problem, how long it occurred, write down the fix, and what the outcome was. You're going to be growing, probably not 500 different crops. You're going to pick a few crops that are going to make you money. And you're going to experience some problems. You're going to overcome them. Next year, you're going to probably see those same problems pop up around the same time. A lot of this stuff is due to the environment, due to pest influxes and pressures. So you're going to have it happen again. You don't want to have to rely on your memory year after year for the fix because, hey, I've done that, right? I've done a lot of relying on your memory. But what happens when you have a worker come in and needs to take over for you because you're too busy and you're going to work on more important things? They're not in your head, okay? They need something to guide them. And by taking these notes, you're creating standard operating procedures for yourself and for any employees in the future to be able to reference. So it's not a month of hassles and heartaches and disappointed customers and loss of revenue. It's an immediate fix to the problem. And again, you can be your own best friend here and your best asset by tracking your nutrients, tracking any test that you pay for, any test that you do. Just take the extra 5 seconds and write the stuff down. Put it in a spreadsheet on your computer, save it in a file and forget about it. But make that part of your everyday because that's why you guys are taking this class, right? There's not enough information out there right now. A lot of these numbers, you're not going to find them anywhere else. I paid for the test, I paid for the equipment, I had to do it myself. It was worth it to me, but if you wait around for all of this stuff to become standardized, perfected, and available for free in the public domain, you're going to be waiting 20 years. You're going to be waiting a while. And you're going to be, instead of getting into aquaponics here on the rise, you're going to be in it down here where there's everybody and their mothers in it. All of the big players are in it, and there's not much of a slice of the pie left to take. Okay, you're getting in it now at the right time. But again, make notes of these problems. I can't tell you how far that has brought me in this science because I do a lot of tests. I do a lot of these maybe over and beyond things because I'm a curious guy. And unfortunately, guessing doesn't do it for me. I need a test to tell me that I was either right or I was wrong and lead me in the right direction. And that has gotten me very far in this science. So we'll leave it at that. That's the end of this session. I hope you learned a lot this week, and I'll see you next week with some more exciting information and aquaponic design techniques.